Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Contour community meeting. Today is April 21st or April 22nd, depending on where you live. And yeah, we got a few things that we want to talk about today, and let's get to it. We'll link to the HackMD, of course, in the chat. So if you want to add something to it, please do. And I'm going to share my screen as well. All right. So got two things here that we want to look at first. The fallback certificate design, and then I'm going to head over to the SNI for clusters. So Steve, do you want to talk about the first one here?
Yeah, so if you go ahead and join into that one. So we had a request from some users that they had some applications that couldn't send SNI. So Contour uses SNI. So SNI is a way to have a certificate, have TLS terminate at basically Envoy. And then Envoy can inspect enough of the header to know what the host is based on that certificate, and then it can direct it to the right route that needs to go to. And in our case, a pod or a service in the back end. And this is kind of neat because now you can have a single, IP address for that matter, or entry point, and have multiple different vhosts tied to that. Right before you had to have, an IP address tied to a specific vhost statically that way. So some users, so that's what Contour does today. We use SNI to implement this ability. But again, some users had some problems where they didn't, their applications couldn't or wouldn't send the SNI header. And when this happens, Contour or Envoy has no way to route that to the correct place. And what happens today is you get like a 404 because basically it doesn't match anything. So the goal of this design is to add the ability to have a fallback certificate. So basically, go down the filter chain in Envoy, and if you don't match any of the vhosts that are configured, then hit this fallback one. And then the certificate will let you basically terminate TLS at Envoy. Envoy can unwrap the header and then see where it should go, route, what place. So the idea here is that we're going to have a new arg to Contour as well as a configuration file. I guess I haven't decided on both or one or the other. So if you scroll up just a little bit, Jonas, up to the other way. So we'll have two parameters in the high-level design there. So there's a fallback certificate, and then there's a configuration file that matches. So what that does is that will pass the secret name you've got configured in your cluster. And then if you scroll down a little bit, and then the idea is to enable a specific vhost to allow this fallback certificate. And that's that down there in that TLS struct, that fallback certificate enabled. So I'm still struggling a little bit. I thought I had this figured out in Envoy. So that there's that parameter that says fallback certificate enabled. And the idea is that we wanted to only allow specific vhosts to do this, right? So maybe you as an operator didn't want your domain name to do this, but somebody else did. I'm struggling in Envoy to figure out a way to do this properly, to pick one domain or the other. Anyway, so this is a design. This is the idea to help implement this feature to solve these requests that can't send the SNI header.
So Steve, you need to do a filter chain match and then add when you do a new filter chain match at the end, then you add the vhosts that opt into it to that one. Just like, so it's just an extension. It should be just an extension of what we do with the SNI already.
Right, but we have that point to a route. So we'd have to build a whole new set of route tables that have basically those that map to these and those that don't. Because you can't have multiple filter chains that match the same thing, right? Because in this example, we're going to say we're not going to match on a server SNI host. We're going to match on any request that's TLS, basically.
Yeah. So if you fall down, you're falling through the list of filter matches, right?
Right.
And at the end, and the last filter match, and you get to the last filter match, which is this, and then that filter match has a HTTP connection manager filter. And then that has the vhosts that are opted into it, right?
See, I don't see it that way. We'll have to look at that together. Because what I see is when you define that last filter chain, it points to a route table. And in Contour today, that route table is a specific set of routes underneath a vhost. So right now it's they all have it or one has it. So that's the struggle. So we have to look at that.
So you're talking more on the Contour internal side, not the Envoy proto representation side.
No, I mean, I'm talking about the Contour side that drives the Envoy configuration. So when we build out the filter chain match. So we'll have to look at that. We don't need to solve it today on this community call, but yeah, to me, it looks like we have to build a whole new set of routing tables, but maybe I'm overlooking it someplace. I thought I had it today, and then I thought about it. I was eating dinner, and I was thinking about it some more, and then it didn't make sense after I thought about it earlier. So we'll have to look at that and see.
Cool.
So yeah, I updated this, James. So if you want to take a look again, anyone has any ideas or thoughts on this, please poke that through.
Hey Steve, really quickly, how do you plan to test this? So I know that some of the customers and some feedback we had, basically what they do is that they put a load balancer in front of Contour, and they basically use it to send SNI health checks. Is that a scenario that you plan to support? Maybe you can use CISO as a front-end load balancer and just, I don't know if CISO supports SNI health checks, but maybe that's something that you might know to test this. Is that an option?
So I was there's like an OpenSSL command you can send that basically doesn't send the SNI header when the request is what I was doing. And then if it matches properly, I should get a certificate back. And if it doesn't, then I don't.
You can test this using the integration tester harness.
Or we could do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a couple ways we can address this. I was just doing it just to validate just my I did a proof of concept on my machine just to see if, how this would work or not. So yeah, the right way to do it is to have the integration test for going forward as well.
Yeah, and I wonder if it makes sense for us to also test this at a little bit scale, not huge scale, but like something reasonable on what the expectations will be for an environment, right? If people are using it for a variety of reasons, like if they're using it for health checks, maybe they're semi-frequent. So that's why I'm bringing the issue of scale.
Yeah, we can approach this however.
What kind of scale, what scale and dimension were you thinking of, Michael?
And then, I don't have anything in mind because nobody gave us any of that data, but we can actually, we can validate that maybe like scale of 100 requests per second type scale.
Yeah, ideally, I think we can have this, have the integration test, and test and all those sort of things. Have this land on master here in 1.5 once we ship 1.4, and then we'll have enough time to have anyone who wants to play with it use the master tag, and then as well as adding additional testing if you'd like before 1.5 would ship, I guess. So.
Right. So you'll action item here is you'll discuss this with James to see the right approach there, and then test this out at some sort of scale.
Yeah, we can do that.
Cool.
I can open a new issue to do the testing piece.
Nice. Next up, SNI for clusters.
Yeah, this one came up. So again, it's an SNI kind of couple days. So we used SNI to do routing, and we had a user who was using an external name service to send requests to a different place. So in Kubernetes, you can have a service, right? And then the request will hit a set of pods. You can also have a different service type of external name. What it does is let you define a DNS name that tells you where the request should go. So the request isn't going to hit or necessarily hit a pod inside your cluster. It's going to hit some of the external name. And this is kind of useful for a bunch of different reasons. But the problem is when you did the request routing out to that external name, we were setting the wrong SNI on the request. So when it went to go hit the second hop, the request would fail. So this is setting the correct hierarchy of SNI. So if you set a request header policy, which means you're going to rewrite the request header whenever you send that request out, this lets you define what the SNI should be. So it's going to use the service first, then the route, and then the external name, if defined. So this is just something that we merged in recently. I thought might be interesting. So.
Nice. Any questions, comments on this one? All right. Next up, we have two issues here around timeout settings.
Yeah, if you could open the 2247, please.
Yep.
So the first issue 2225 was raised by PIMS about exposing more Envoy configuration knobs, and I was reluctant. This was raised back when Dave was still here. He was reluctant to just expose a whole bunch of knobs without talking about why each of the knobs needed to be exposed. And then so PIMS opened 2247, which was just about max connection duration. We had a bit of a back and forth and discussion, and he has a, so PIMS, I don't think he's on the call, but he does have a fair point, that yeah, in his use case, being able to configure max connection duration is important, because you can't use an idle timeout because there's keep alives at higher layers. This is a discussion that we've had a lot, especially for a lot of parameters in Envoy, but especially around timeouts. So what I am going to do is, I think what we're going to do here is, I wanted to have a conversation today about changing our, hey, we won't just expose config settings, more general policy, and making it a bit more nuanced here. I think for timeouts, there are enough use cases where you need to mess with the timeouts that we will expose like a large set of the timeouts as both contour defaults, set are configurable probably via the config file, and also as HTTP proxy timeout policy fields, so that you can override the default if that's what you want. The reason for this is just that there are a bunch of use cases that that really do need it, and I think the reason that I've historically been reluctant is that the Envoy timeouts are really confusingly named. They're like they're named. They make a lot of sense when Envoy is running as a service mesh proxy, but they don't make a lot of sense when you're running as a reverse proxy for Ingress. But so I think the way that we need to manage that problem is that we need to do a, here's how we need to firstly consider what name we expose the settings as. And I think my current feeling is that we should expose the settings from the perspective of the client, the HTTP client that we're talking about, rather than use Envoy's names and then have documentation that tells you about what the timeouts are, how you should use them, and what the contour names are for the Envoy names. The reason that I think we should do that is that a large part of the utility of Contour is that we want to make it so that you don't have to understand everything about Envoy. You shouldn't need to read the Envoy documentation to use Contour. And so if we use the Envoy names, then almost certainly people will have to go and read the Envoy documentation to understand what the timeouts do. If we change the names a little bit, then we should be able to make it so that they're a bit more self-explanatory. I was thinking of using the Nginx annotation names as a starting point. But yeah, so I guess the key points, the TLDR here is, I think we should do a bunch of the timeout settings and add them as configurable defaults with overrides in per setting overrides in HTTP proxy, possibly with different names, and a whole bunch of documentation around the timeouts. Now, the other thing that's important to say here is I don't feel that this doesn't change my position on other Envoy config. I don't think that we should ever allow direct Envoy configuration because of the stated goal that I said before of you shouldn't need to understand Envoy to use Contour. And I think that the more you expose that, the more you expose the underlying implementation detail of it being Envoy, the less that is the case. So yeah, I wanted to have a discussion about that, about what my thoughts are there. So anyone else have anything to say there?
No, I agree. Having more configuration is good. I mean, I've worked in places where, minutes for an application to respond was acceptable. And then other places where seconds was acceptable. You know what I mean? So what may work for one person is not going to work for somebody else. So having those knobs, I think, for these specific things would be useful.
Yeah, I'm also in favor of these things being site specific.
Anytime we start making assumptions about everyone's usage and everyone's environment specific details is, just a recipe for trouble, right? So use sensible defaults and give them the option to tune is really the right approach.
Yeah, I think in general that's the case, yeah, but the thing that we need to be careful about is that when we expose the tunables, that we don't wed the tunables that we expose too closely to the Envoy implementation. And that's the other thing that's relevant here to just mention is that in the case of some config that we can talk about this in a similar way to, I'm thinking about the configuration of third-party services like external auth and rate limiting. In those cases, I think that the important burden on us is that Contour accepts the configuration. Contour needs to be able to surface information about whether or not that configuration is working. So you shouldn't need to have to talk to Envoy to find out if the thing that you told Contour to configure is working. So in the event that you have rate limiting, you should be able to know what rate limiting is doing on the objects that rate limiting is operating on, and the same for external auth, and the same for any other third-party services we do. So yeah, I just think it's important just to call that out. But I think in this case, the timeout settings, there's no way for you to surface information really back about them. The behavior will be obvious from the client. And the last concern that I originally had was that that we do need to just keep an eye on the number of settings that we expose. PIMS has a fork of Contour. It currently has 43 extra flags than Contour currently does, and Contour already has on the order of 20 to 30 flags. So you're talking almost 80 different flags that you can pass to Contour to configure things. Like that feels like too many flags to me. And so the thing that I'm worried about is it's easy to add flags and it's hard to take them away because you have to do a full deprecation cycle. You need to deprecate things. You need to give people time to move away, because if you have config flags and they're no longer present, your deployment will not start. So that's the reason why I'm reluctant to just add lots of things, because it adds to the product support burden for us.
To be fair, though, we did that with the Ingress flag and ripped it out in one release, so and caused a bunch of problems.
So I mean,
Yeah.
Nick,
that's the reason why that adding things is costly, right? Like that is a good lesson to learn.
Sure, but I mean, we didn't. Yeah.
So Nick, I agree with you 100%. But at the end of the day, Envoy, obviously does a lot more things than just Ingress for our scenarios. But it has those config for a reason, right? They didn't just hide them either. So we should be judicious about what we add and when we add. I completely agree with you. But obviously we listen to our users and make those decisions on a one-off basis as needed.
Yes, and so I think in terms of the timeouts, I'm going to go back to PIMS on 2225 and say, okay, we're going to do a more broad bit of work here to add a bunch of timeouts. Probably those 4 that he's got that you can see on the screen there would be where I'd start, and maybe with max connection timeout, max connection duration as well. So that's 5. I think those 5 are probably a good place to start. Being able to set the request timeout, though, is not like the one that Envoy calls the request timeout is not the request timeout from the point of view of the client. That is a great example of how the name is very confusing.
And by the way, if you remember, we had one of the issues that someone had was the connect timeout, right? That was issue 2264. If you can open that really quickly, Jonas. That was a prime example of someone that wanted something to be changed, but it wasn't really the right thing. And it turned out that they had much bigger environment problems than basically changing a timeout. It wouldn't have fixed it. So.
Yes, I mean, James and I talked about that one, and I think, James, you raised the fair point that if they had been able to change it, they would have increased it and found that it didn't fix the problem much faster than it took us to find it. So there is that point. But I think I do. That's one of the things that I worry about, is that people might be building themselves book guns that they don't know about by tuning things when they don't, when they haven't carefully read the Envoy documentation. And that's why it's really important for us to make sure that we document those timeouts, how they work in the Contour case, and not just in the Envoy case. In the Envoy case, In the Envoy documentation, it is super specific about exactly how all the timeouts work, but it doesn't tell you about what that means when you're thinking about it in a Ingress proxy kind of context. And so that's what we need to do as part of this thing.
Generally, are the defaults for Contour, do they align with the defaults for
they're actually
Envoy?
They're set. They are slightly different from Envoy's internal defaults, but they're set. There's an issue on the Envoy repo that sort of says, hey, when you're using Contour, when you're using Envoy in a reverse proxy kind of way rather than as a mesh proxy, then there's some settings that you should do differently. We base some of the things on that issue, and then I think there's a few of them that we've messed with since then. So Contour's defaults are not 100% the same as Envoy's defaults. Some of the timeouts have no value by default in Envoy, and we do set a value. And conversely, some of them we don't set a value and just use the default Envoy one. So and it's different on a per timeout basis because they all have very specific mesh meanings that don't necessarily translate to the reverse proxy meanings. So that's why we need the documentation. Does that answer your question, Damien?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think if if it aligns with upstream Envoy defaults, and as you mentioned, it's with the caveat of the upstream Envoy for reverse proxy or Ingress, however that Envoy documentation states it. If that's kind of like the standard, and then any deviation from that is minimized with a strong use case to change defaults from upstream. At least that's what I've always seen as kind of a successful long-term approach, is if you could align with upstream as much as possible, limit deviation. It makes life a lot easier in the long term.
Yeah, so that's definitely what I want to do, though. I mean, that's why the position up till now has been, hey, you can't configure these. You get the defaults that we've set, which are based on our best knowledge of, what's available upstream and how you should tune that for in a reverse proxy context. And so those will still be the defaults. I'm not suggesting changing the defaults. I'm just saying that, hey, in the case of timeouts, I'm willing to allow people to override the defaults, on a per site basis. And also on a per proxy basis, per resource basis. I think having both is important because it allows you to try out the timeouts on just one service without having to restart your Contour and things like that. That's all I intended to say on this one. I've got some comments to type up on those issues, but I wanted to have talked about it in the meeting first. And then once that's done, I'll generate some further issues to sort of cover the work, and then we will get them prioritized. I would say, they're not going to make it into 1.4 because 1.4 is due out at the end of this week. Hopefully they might make it into 1.5.
So as a newbie, just trying to familiarize myself with kind of the workflow. So if the community says, yeah, this is something that we need to tackle, which sounds like that's the case, and then is the next step typically, create an enhancement that documents how any API changes and plans for implementation and such?
Yeah. So in this case, because it's because it's a reasonably straightforward thing to describe, I'll do it in an issue. But in the case of something a bit more complicated, the usual flow that we have is that you propose it, you make a design PR. There's an MD template for sort of Contour. Yes, thank you, Jonas. There's these ones here.
Hey, Jonas, it's in the community. So we have a proposal. Yeah, I mean, either or. I mean, there's a proposals folder. So there's a template there. You can submit a proposal, and then we can sit down and discuss it. You can bring it. The general guideline is if someone has a proposal that's something that's meaty, is file it in, give people in a few days to kind of digest this and ask some questions, and then show up at the community meeting and we can discuss it.
Yeah, perfect.
And then we can figure it out from there what the path is, and who's going to work on it, and where can it kind of stack ranks with the rest of the items that we have for Contour.
Yeah,
got it. Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. So in the case of these timeout changes, like it is a big policy change, but it's not a big like actual architectural change or anything. It's yeah. So in this case, I'll just document it in an issue with a checklist of things that need to be done. But yeah, in the case of, for example, Steve has been doing a design proposal for how the fallback certificate works that he mentioned earlier, and that's what we sort of work around. We sort of rally around that to talk about how the design works, and then once that's done, then Steve will generate an issue to actually implement that, and then that's the normal flow. I think we're still in the process of changing over to use the community repo proposals section from using the design directory inside the actual Contour repo.
Yeah, thanks for some of that background.
Yep. There is actually one thing that I need to add in there, Jonas, that I haven't added in yet. That is just, we need to talk about 1.4. I will put some notes in there.
We can give the high level right now. I mean, we don't have to end at the top of the hour. If folks are interested in staying a few more minutes, we can spend a couple of minutes on 1.4. Daniel and Mike, would it be interesting for you guys to listen a little bit on what's coming in 1.4?
Yeah, I'm interested.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll just quickly run through what we've got in there so far. So far, we have the TLS client authentication. So you can configure HTTP objects to request validation of client certificates. This is for between the browser client and Envoy, essentially, not upstream at this time. We will add that later, but it's not added yet. And there's a bunch of associated documentation, and there's been a lot of talk from that, and that's all been done by Tero. So we really appreciate that work from Tero. Now, there's been a couple of changes to Ingress, to the Ingress document behavior. One of which Steve has made is that the Ingress class annotation previously worked in a bit of a weird way. If you specified an Ingress class to Contour and basically said, please only watch this Ingress class, Contour would watch that Ingress class plus Ingress objects with no Ingress class. Which on reflection, we all felt was a bug. So we've changed that so that now if you specify an Ingress class, Contour will only watch that. There are a couple of backwards compatibility behaviors that are a little bit weird. If you don't specify an Ingress class, Contour will watch Ingress objects with no annotation, but also Ingress objects with an Ingress class set to the string Contour. That's for backwards compatibility reasons. But yeah, so that's sort of the important part there is that, if you set an Ingress class, only objects with that Ingress class will take effect. That applies across, it's mainly for the Ingress document, but it also actually applies to the HTTP proxy document as well. The other change for Ingress is that we're going to write a status load balancer addresses block to Ingress objects, which gives you the address that the Ingress object should be reachable on. This is useful for external DNS and the conformance testing. The basic conformance testing that someone did a little while ago, and I'm sure there are other ways that it's useful. It's actually an important part of the Ingress contract that we've just never fulfilled. So this is sort of an old outstanding request that is now done. We've separated the health and metrics listeners as a result of a customer thing. The S&I bindings have been fixed in a couple of ways. Steve's done the fixes that he talked about earlier. James has also done APR to bind the S&I more closely to the host header, so that you can't use Contour for domain fronting, where you supply one S&I and then supply a different host header at the higher protocol layers, which in most cases is going to be a security problem, especially if you're doing client certificate authentication, like in the first feature. And then there's a few other, there's a bunch of other changes that will be detailed more in the change log, but those are sort of the headline features. Any questions there from Daniel or Micaiah? Since everyone else on this call, I've already talked to them about this before.
I guess the only question I had is, it's been a little while since we talked about Ingress V2 support and Contour. Do you mind giving a quick update on where that's at?
Right now we're still at where we were before. The objects are supported in their current state, in that Contour will watch them and knows how to watch them, but that's all that we've done at the moment. We haven't implemented any behavior. I think the behavior I've been waiting for us to sort of shake out the behavior of, especially if there's some pretty fundamental things being talked about with gateway class and gateway and stuff like that. So I've been waiting for that to shake out a little bit. As soon as I feel more confident that that's a little bit more stable, then I'm going to look at implementing, sort of gateway class defines gateway relations and have the gateway class and the gateway sort of be some of that initial behavior implemented.
That makes sense.
Yep. Well, we are over time, so Daniel and Micaiah, questions from you. If not, I guess we can call it done.
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
No worries. Awesome.
Well, with that, I'm going to close out. Thank you all for joining today. And next week we'll have this meeting at 1 p.m. Eastern US time. So if you want to join during that time, you are more than welcome. Otherwise, we'll see you back here in 2 weeks during this time. Have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you.